the nail I'm trying to hit home, or what's the phrase? The nail, no, it's not the nail. What's the phrase?
The point you're trying to hit home?
The point I'm trying to drive home, right?
There you go. There we go.
Most of us spend a quarter of our lives in the place we call school. And the more time we spend there, the more we complain.
It's no secret that the schooling system in America has flaws. So, join us once a month as we take a look at the ins and outs of American schooling to find the bad and the good.
Let's get started then. I'm Amar.
I'm Matthew.
And this is Our Side of the Coin, Season 2.
Hey, welcome back to another episode this week on Our Side of the Coin. This week, we're going to be talking about politics in the classroom. Matt, take it away.
So, this series is about talking about education. And so, education is a big umbrella term for a lot of different things. But I believe that politics should be a part of the education experience, and I think that schools have a responsibility to educate to some extent political thinking and discussion.
Yeah, so I agree with you there. And I think the only caveat really on that point, because so the way when we're talking about politics in the classroom, politics doesn't necessarily, only mean, oh, I support XYZ president or XYZ policy. Politics is like almost, it's just a series of the dynamics of how we think society should run, right? And naturally, schools and education are going to be a large part in our upbringing and informing our thinking of how society should run. The people we're surrounded with when we grow up, the systems that we're placed under, the power relations that we experience, right? All of these play a factor into, the politics or quote unquote politics that we, start to believe in as we grow up. So when we say politics, and schools have a responsibility to promote this kind of thinking, we don't necessarily mean that, schools should promote a party, schools should promote a policy, or any of these sorts of things. What we're talking about really is schools should be able to promote critical thinking skills, essentially. And more than critical thinking skills, the ability to take beliefs, take empirical fact, take data, combine these all together to form educated beliefs and conclusions that we can continuously update, regardless of, former biases or heuristics that might be at play.
I totally agree. I think critical thinking is a great word for the point. As you said, the point isn't necessarily in fact, I think we can both agree that schools should, if at all, avoid leaning specifically left or right or whatever. The discussion shouldn't be about the discussion here isn't about specifics. It's that I think people should be educated how to think critically, because this might be a little controversial, but I think recent events past year or 2 years, I've seen a sort of lack of critical thinking a little bit in this country. So so when you're thinking about politics and where do people's political beliefs come from? If people have them, some people decide not to have them, but if you do, where do they come from? I see three big players. First is parents. I think we could agree. Mm-hmm. Second is the media.
Yeah. What
do people hear and see? And then I think the third is your peers. And I think that's where the schools fit in with that, because the schools is where students in school, that's where they meet people. And I think schools should be a place where you can talk and discuss with your peers and develop those sort of political beliefs.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Schools, you have this open ground, and that's the wonderful thing about especially larger schools, more diverse schools, is you get this array of perspectives, right? And being able to incorporate these different perspectives into your daily life, understanding the problem is not a linear problem. There are always multiple factors playing into any problem that you talk about ever, right? Nothing is 1 + 1 = 2 in this world. So, but the problem that I see occurring from this situation by allowing, and this is just more maybe a topic of censorship more than anything, right? Is sometimes if you have a situation where you may go to a school in a certain area, or the people that go to a certain school are from a certain background, right? And maybe we'll touch on those specific later as well. But you get this idea of this almost herd-like mentality, right? Where because the people in this area are majority, whichever way they want to lean, all of a sudden now you created an echo chamber where those who may have an opposing opinion are drowned out, essentially, right? And so what I'm going to ask you there is, how do you think schools should prevent this domination, this like herd-like mentality from occurring?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that schools should like actively try to create an environment where you can have like open discussion. And I think that like in that situation you're describing where there is a majority like conclusion in the student base, I think maybe the school might even like I think the school should be aware of what the situation is in their student body. I mean, obviously I think this becomes more relevant the older your student body is. I think this is more of a sort of a thing for high schools than
definitely high schools and universities mainly.
But yeah, universities also. I think that the school should be aware of their student body, and if there is like if there is too much of a,
if there's an overwhelming political ideology that's dominating the conversation, essentially, right?
Yeah. I think that schools should maybe in a way try to play like devil's advocate and at least like suggest it's okay for people to decide to come to conclusions on their own. I think the school should make sure that those conclusions are like being made by the student bodies explicitly, as opposed to just being told that is what is good, or just not only hearing that sort of thing. So I think
I like where we're going with that. And I mean, I don't want to poke holes in the argument, right? The only thing that I'm really seeing when we say like, schools should play devil advocate, this is true. Schools should definitely consider all the perspectives, especially when you're teaching classes which may be sensitive to politics, history, English, the arts, right? Like the classes that might be most impacted by, that political ideology is influencing. And especially if teachers, and obviously teachers are humans, right? Teachers are not like some robots that can maintain an almost definite neutrality all the time, right? But even teachers should not let their personal beliefs bleed into what they are teaching their students, so much so, right? Like, you should not, as a teacher, be forcing personal beliefs onto your students, making it like, part of a curriculum, making it part of a, or like, testing specific political ideologies and making it so important that students are forced to, swing one way or another. And I like the idea of devil's advocate, especially trying to maintain that neutrality. I know it's a little bit difficult for teachers and admin sometimes, especially when personal beliefs are at play, to maintain a true neutrality. And this gets into, other psychological phenomena like implicit biases. And we'll touch on that later. But true neutrality is ideal for most school situations. I know it's not exactly always attainable, but in an idealistic world, we do want to see a sort of multiple perspective take on several key issues.
So, the thing you mentioned about there being like a sort of like herd mentality sort of thing, or there being like a clear dominant ideology, I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. If the students come to their own conclusions that this is what they believe in, that is totally fine. I think that's the way it should be. I think the school has a responsibility to make sure that is the case by teaching students how to come to those conclusions, and also making sure that those students are challenged in those views. Because what can happen in that scenario is somebody goes to that school and all they hear is one sort of thing, and then so that is what they believe in. I think the school has a responsibility to. I think the school can and has a responsibility to try to avoid that.
Yeah, and I think a good way schools can do that is essentially just by introducing these sort of new ideas into classes like history, like literature, like the arts, right? Simply, you don't have to teach a political ideology. You don't have to teach opposing views. All you have to do is basically bring both sides or all the sides of the story into whatever you're teaching, right? You don't want to, just show, XYZ was bad, XYZ was good. They often say, victors write history, but ideally in a history class, we don't care what the victor thought. We want to know what happened, right? So I think the same sort of logic applies to when we're talking about politics in the classroom, right? Because we don't want to see, who wins, who loses, right? We want to see, why is what is happening? Why should we believe in XYZ? What are the pros of XYZ? What are the cons of XYZ?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, and another thing that we could talk about if we're stemming from this is like school censorship. So when we're talking about school censorship, how far do you think schools should be able to censor their student body? I mean, because there's obviously a point where, free speech becomes hate speech, or vice versa, where free speech just becomes propaganda in a way. Well, not even propaganda. Ignore propaganda. Just how do we know when schools should be able to cut off free speech from hate speech?
Yeah, I mean, this is the bane of the idea of an open forum. Is that if you have I think the goal is you should have a space where you can say anything. But of course, there are some things that shouldn't be said. So what does a school do in that situation?
Yeah, I think that's a great start to this problem, right? And, we had these sort of ethical societal standards, and I'm not going to bring any examples into this. We're trying to leave politics out of our political discussion, ironically enough. But what I'm talking, like, there is a point where, certain words can be, it's not even about offensive. It's when certain words can hurt groups of people or cause damage. We've seen the power of some words, some movements, and how much damage or how much benefit they can have. Words are nothing but a tool that can be like utilized by student bodies, but schools do have a responsibility to teach their students of, not even what should be said and what shouldn't be said. It should be more so, we shouldn't be out here trying to hurt people. We shouldn't be out here trying to cause damage to others at no expense to us, right? We don't want to hurt other people. That's basically it, right? I think schools do have a responsibility to censor these sorts of ideas. Now, where they censor these sort of ideas could be a whole nother topic on its own. So I think we'll ignore the nuances and the specifics of that. But I think they do still have that responsibility.
Yeah. It's dangerous because, like, at the same time, I would definitely agree with that point of, like, the impact. I think if a school can clearly see that, like, this idea is directly, like, hurtful, I think the school has a right to intervene.
I think that's a better word than censor. Yeah.
The obvious concern is when does the school have that right? Like, because people, like, that's the whole nature of this debate, is that it can be debated. Almost impossible.
For the sake of time, we won't get into super specifics of that. We'll just touch the broad general idea of intervention and censorship in schools. Let's move on to the next topic. So when we talk about educated beliefs and thinking critically, and this is maybe where we get more into the specifics of how we do that, right? How do we teach people to separate beliefs from those educated conclusions? How do we teach people to eliminate their preliminary biases when we're going about teaching neutral perspectives?
No, I think it's a good question. And in fact, I don't see anything inherently wrong with having a belief. I think educated conclusions are the goal, but I think beliefs can be educated. I think it's all right to, like, have, like, a preconceived notion, I guess, is sort of like intuition, but, like, after the fact of that, I think first of all, students should be aware of that. I think schools should try to, like, make people question their own beliefs instead of taking them for granted. And then I think after that, I feel like schools should be able to give students the tools to be able to justify them.
Yeah, I basically agree with that as well. I also think when we're talking about thinking critically, again, the nail I'm trying to hit home, or what's the phrase? The nail, no, it's not the nail. What's the phrase?
Point you're trying to hit home?
The point I'm trying to drive home, right, is essentially...
There we go.
The ball drive. Okay. The point I'm trying to drive home, right, and I'm going to say this over and over again, is we want to see multiple perspectives, right? We want to challenge belief. I 100% agree with you that beliefs are not inherently bad. And in fact, a lot of our education, a lot of our knowledge is based on our own personal belief systems. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Nothing in this world is exactly solid. Everything is continuously being updated. Now, that being said, right, the ability to update is a critical component for a lot of students, and a lot of schools often neglect to teach this idea. A lot of schools are often focused on, okay, if my students are able to perform well on XYZ exams, or are able to, just do what they're required to do, essentially obedience training, they'll never be able to update their own belief systems, right? And I think this is where a lot of schools fall short, and especially in the American system. I know a lot of other systems in the world, especially more international systems, are great at challenging this sort of idea that, okay, you're just here at school to learn these XYZ things and nothing else, right? I think but I think the American system falls very short on teaching its students to update critically on new evidence.
Yeah, I would actually, I really like that point. Like, rather than, I think education should be all about giving people tools to be successful and good people in life. And I think a lot of, a downfall of the American school system is, rather than giving tools for that, they're instead just presenting you with information that's relevant in the short term.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's a point, right? And sometimes you just can't fault the schools themselves, the school system. The school system has been doing this for a while, right? It's almost become a routine. It's not easy to change a system like that in a year or 2 years. And we know we're continuously trying to update, but maybe it's just not fast enough. And, schools sometimes as well, there's this idea in psychology. It's called implicit biases, right? Schools will believe there is no bias in the way they are teaching. There is no bias in the way that their student body thinks, right? And essentially what implicit bias state is that bias that we don't have any biases, right? The bias that we think we are completely being neutral and completely being rational the entire time that we are doing whatever we're doing, talking, learning, teaching, speaking to others, right? Implicit biases play a large part, I would argue, into why the school system is not neutral or as neutral as it should be today.
Mm. Well, on that topic of neutrality, I think we briefly wanted to discuss some specific scenarios where the school may not be completely biased. So the first one we wanted to touch on was the idea of a religious school, because clearly there you can see that there would be a dominant ideology. So did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, religious schools are going to be, I think, a little different because more so the belief system is already predetermined in a lot of religious schools, right? Politics are often influenced by the religion of said schools. But in a way, I think when you have a situation such as a religious school, so right, oftentimes what you end up getting is essentially, let me give you an example, right? So I have younger siblings that went to an Islamic school, and largely it would be focused on, they would have 2 or 3 classes on Islam, right? Islamic studies, etc. And then you would have, your separate courses, math, science, history. And history was still, and many of these things were still based on the American school system curriculum. History was based on American history. Math is math, right? Or at least it was until Eureka Math, but that's a topic for another time. And science is, for the most part, science minus some, minor discretions with evolutionary theory or other religiously argued theories, right? I would still say you still have that sort of diverse knowledge mindset in a religious school, non-politically. I think you can talk more about that.
Yeah, well, before I do, I want to make the disclaimer that I do not have, I don't really have any experience with a religious school at all. But just thinking about the idea of a religious school, I think that you can run the danger of losing that sort of variety of experiences because of the obvious fact that we talked about earlier. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but I think you can see how that oftentimes can happen. So I think that when you're running a religious school, you should be aware that while you do have a common idea between your student body, that doesn't mean that there isn't any benefit to thinking critically about it. And so just as a wrap up, I don't have any problem with the existence of religious schools. I think that they're fine if parents decide that it's the right choice for their child, and hopefully, as a child ages, they would agree. But I think that it's important to make sure that students in this kind of environment aren't sheltered from opposing ideas, and not necessarily, and definitely not opposing ideas with the intent of changing people's minds. But I think it's important when you come to a conclusion to still have it be challenged.
Right, and I mean, I just want to elaborate on that point. I mean, a lot of times and I'm not talking about, when we talk about this, I don't think you're talking about, having them see other religion, trying to not send in priests into an Islamic school, or sending in imams to a Christian school, right? I think you're more so talking about, in an Islamic high school, maybe they should still teach evolutionary theory just so the students are aware of what evolutionary theory might be, even if Islam does or does not support it, right? Or same thing in a Christian school. They should still know what these sort of other theories or scientific theories from an academic standpoint are. Mm-hmm. Essentially,
in the areas where there are debates that come from the religious system, I think that the debate should still be talked about, and I think that this environment is a great place to talk about it because they'll have more knowledge in that area. But I think the debate shouldn't be avoided.
Yeah, I agree with you there. You don't want to leave out information that could be relevant to a discussion at all. Let's wrap this up. We're going to talk a little bit about international schools. I'm going to let Matt start with that.
Yeah, so we went to an international school called Washtenaw International High School. And so, briefly, disclaimer, we only went to Wahe, as our knowledge of international schools, so I don't know how relevant Wahe is as an example. But I think Wahe is an interesting example for this topic because you can kind of see dominating ideology, but it's not nearly as explicit as the religious school example we talked about. So just in general, I think just my interpretation of the goals of an international school, you can see how maybe it would align more with progressive ideas. And so I believe you can clearly see that in Wahe if you attend it and look at it. Wahe, from my experience, was definitely a left-leaning environment. And when I say that, I don't mean the student body was left-leaning majority. What I mean by that is that what you heard was mostly left-leaning. And so one of the goals that the school had was promoting political thinking. However, I think that controversial, but I think that it definitely has room for improvement because it was hard to argue about things that, it was just hard. The environment left a little less room for discussion than I would have liked.
Yeah, and I don't even want to just talk about Washington International, right? I see a lot of people from different international schools seeing a similar, almost a complaint sometimes, right? Where you go into these international schools, you will end up with a very diverse perspective, naturally, right? It's an international school. You're going to get different people from different ethnicities, probably sometimes even from different parts of the world that are attending such schools, right? Often these schools earn this title of international as well because they're in the IB program or they're renowned for something, whether that be on a national level or international level. So when you get such perspective, it naturally becomes an idea for the administration, and it's not their fault, right? In a sense, in that it's almost like we talked about with implicit biases. They think they're being perfectly neutral, right? In their eyes, they believe, and I'm not talking about just Y-High here, although Y-High is an example of this, right? A lot of international schools will have administration that is more so focused on one side of the political spectrum, whichever side that may be, right? You often create this, okay, we want our international students to see that this is a quote unquote true way or good, set a moral standard by it. And, naturally, this would get into a conversation of what is right, what is wrong, which is why I'm saying both. It's not really one side or another, right? It's the idea that you often get, like you said, locked into the situation where if you have an opposing view and you are to state an opposing view, there would be more consequences, not necessarily physical consequences, not necessarily tangible consequences necessarily, right? But there are often ideas that are lost in this sort of environment.
I think that saying that you are promoting open discussion is different from promoting open discussion. Is as always, like, it's easier said than done, obviously, but I think in this environment, I think like this, the school had, I think that their heart was in the right place, but they had this agenda, and I think sometimes it's necessary to realize that you still need, to have an open discussion, there has to be an opposing viewpoint.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great way to put it. And like we said, when we're talking about politics in the classroom, we're talking completely politically neutrally, right? We're simply talking about the idea that open platforms do require the discussion from multiple perspectives. It can't just be an echo chamber of sorts. That's it. Yeah, that's all we mean when we talk about open discussion.
We were talking earlier about like dangerous ideas, but I think it's important that, like, to have this open discussion, there have to be ideas that you aren't okay with.
And I think a lot of schools in America, regardless of political ideologies, struggle with this idea that I love the way that you put it right there, right? They just can't create the open platform that they want to create because they are unaware of the social consequences or intangible consequences that may result therefrom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I think the word "therefrom" is a great way to end the podcast.
All right. Thank you guys for watching or listening. Be sure to check us out every month. We'll be uploading on every month. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Let us know how we can improve. Sayonara.